Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Port Charles had never felt heavier. A sense of suffocating tension permeated every hallway, every quiet glance, every breath between Portia and Curtis. The once vibrant hope for reconciliation that lingered between them like the final flicker of a dying candle had all but vanished, extinguished by the weight of accumulated lies, betrayals, and long-suppressed desires. Their marriage, once a sanctuary of devotion and resilience, had become a battlefield littered with emotional shrapnel. No longer were the wounds mere scratches caused by misunderstandings or circumstantial omissions. These were deep, gaping gashes born of repeated deception, wounds that festered with each unspoken resentment, with every reminder of what was promised and never delivered. And at the center of it all stood Portia, a woman caught between guilt and longing, burdened by the knowledge that her choices had erected an unscalable wall between her and the man she had once vowed to love with unwavering faith. Curtis, once the embodiment of patience and forgiveness, no longer looked at Portia with the softness that once defined his gaze. The love in his eyes had calcified into suspicion and pain, his warmth cooled into a guarded indifference that frightened even him. He was no stranger to hardship, but this felt different, more personal, more permanent. He couldn't shake the feeling that some fundamental trust had been irreparably shattered, and every time he tried to piece it back together, another fracture appeared, more jagged than the last. Yet this wasn't only about what Portia had done or failed to say. The damage was now being fueled by outside forces, by the quiet but unmistakable presence of others whose arrival in their orbit had disrupted the fragile equilibrium they once shared. Jordan had re-entered Curtis's world not with fanfare or grand declarations, but with a stillness that spoke louder than any words could. Her calm, her understanding, her ability to read the silences between sentences, reminded Curtis of the version of himself he'd almost forgotten. A man who knew how to love without fear, how to trust without hesitation. Sitting beside Jordan, reliving memories that once defined them, felt less like betrayal and more like homecoming. She didn't have to try to win him back. Her very presence stirred something deep within him, a dormant yearning that had survived years of disappointment. And as they reminisced under the soft glow of the Metro Court pool lights, he felt something shift. A realization that his emotional anchor may never have left her shore. Meanwhile, Portia wandered through her own storm, clinging to the fragile remnants of her marriage while unknowingly moving closer to its unraveling. Isaiah had entered her life at first as a colleague, then as a confidant, and now, without warning, as something dangerously more. Their connection had been subtle, simmering beneath professional boundaries and mutual respect. But when fate placed them in that fleeting, charged moment, her weary from a long shift, him standing bare-chested in nothing but a towel, the veil between friendship and temptation began to tear. It wasn't what was said that mattered, but what was felt. A glance held too long. A breath that came too quickly. The awkward silence that followed wasn't empty, it was loud with implication. Portia could feel the line blurring, could sense the heat rising around her, and yet she didn't retreat. It wasn't recklessness, it was hunger. Not for passion, but for understanding. For comfort. For the feeling of being seen. Isaiah's patience, his calm presence, his quiet willingness to just be there filled a void Curtis no longer could. What had started as casual conversation began to linger in her thoughts at night. The way he gently brushed her shoulder when they passed in the corridor, the way he paused before saying goodbye, the way his eyes searched hers as if trying to decipher what lay behind the practiced smile she wore, it all fed into a narrative she couldn't escape. Isaiah was becoming more than a man in the background. He was a refuge. And she was slipping. The cruelest irony of it all was that her jealousy over Jordan was what propelled her into Isaiah's orbit with even greater momentum. Each time she imagined Curtis leaning toward his ex-wife, laughing as if time had never passed between them, her insecurities multiplied. In a desperate effort to reclaim her self-worth, she sought validation where she could find it, and Isaiah, knowingly or not, gave it freely. Meanwhile, Curtis, still blind to how close Portia was to crossing a line, continued to let his heart drift further into the gravitational pull of a love he thought he had left behind. It was never spoken aloud, but both Curtis and Portia could feel the tectonic plates of their relationship shifting beneath them, cracking the foundation with every unacknowledged longing and unmet need. What made this tragedy even more harrowing was the quietness of it. There were no explosive confrontations, no grand confessions. Just a slow, relentless erosion. Curtis, brooding late into the night as he scrolled through photos of better days, trying to convince himself that what he had with Portia could still be salvaged. Portia, standing by the hospital window after another shift, watching Isaiah leave with a warmth in her chest that scared her more than she'd admit. Their marriage wasn't ending with a bang, but with a silence so loud it drowned out everything else. And as they both hovered on the edge of emotional betrayal, the real question was no longer who would stray first, but whether either of them would even care once it happened. In a city where deception often masquerades as love, and loyalty is a currency more valuable than truth, Portia and Curtis had become two strangers playing house, bound not by love, but by the illusion of what it once was. And as the shadows of Jordan and Isaiah grew longer and more entwined with their own, it was clear that Port Charles was witnessing the quiet implosion of a marriage that had already died in everything but name. The question was no longer who would betray first, but rather when that betrayal would inevitably take shape, and more importantly, whether anything would be left to salvage once the boundary was crossed. In Port Charles, where every relationship is a tightrope walk between past regrets and present temptations, the emotional unraveling of Curtis and Portia had become a slow-motion tragedy playing out in broad daylight. Their marriage wasn't teetering on the edge of destruction because of one dramatic infidelity, but because of 1,000 silent choices, each one carrying them further from the life they had once promised to build together. Curtis stood by the shimmering edge of the Metro Court pool, watching as Jordan walked away, her poise unshaken, her every step echoing a quiet strength that only made her more captivating. There was something magnetic in the way she carried herself, not with arrogance, but with the serene confidence of someone who had survived heartbreak and emerged wiser, calmer, stronger. As the warm summer air wrapped around him, Curtis found himself struck by the unbearable weight of yearning, not just for the woman Jordan was now, but for the version of himself that he had once been when he was with her. In that fleeting moment, as he followed her figure fading into the city's golden dusk, he was no longer certain whether he was mourning his broken marriage or the part of his soul he had lost when he let Jordan go. Across town, Portia stood rooted in the hallway of General Hospital, her heart clenching as her eyes locked with Isaiah's. His gaze was neither intense nor demanding, but it held a kind of quiet perception that felt almost invasive. It was as if he could see the corners of her soul that even Curtis had stopped noticing, her exhaustion, her longing, her slow unraveling. There was no judgment in Isaiah's eyes, only understanding. And that was what terrified her the most. Because in Isaiah's presence, Portia didn't have to explain herself. She didn't have to be perfect. She didn't have to fight for emotional crumbs. She could just be. And with every glance they exchanged, with every breath of charged silence between them, she felt the thin veil between emotional intimacy and physical temptation grow dangerously transparent. Neither Portia nor Curtis had yet taken that irreversible step, but they were already betraying each other in the quietest, most lethal ways. In Curtis's mind, the comfort of Jordan's voice had become a sanctuary. In Portia's world, Isaiah's emotional availability had become an anchor. They were forming bonds that could not be undone, ties that stretched far beyond the realm of platonic friendship and deep into the territory of emotional adultery. Every whispered memory, every lingering touch, every unspoken wish was a step further down the path of no return. What remained now was not the question of whether they loved each other, but whether they respected what their love had once meant. Because once the soul begins to wander, even if the body remains, reconciliation becomes a ghost. One night of weakness, one mistake under the guise of emotional need, could obliterate any hope of healing. The cracks in their foundation were no longer subtle. They had become gaping wounds, and time, rather than healing them, only poured salt inside. And yet, even knowing this, neither Curtis nor Portia could stop their hearts from drifting toward the people who reminded them of who they used to be, before bitterness, before betrayal, before distance made strangers of them. Curtis knew deep down that if he reached out to Jordan, she might still take his hand. Not out of pity, but because their shared history had never fully died, it had only gone quiet, waiting for the right moment to reawaken. And Portia, trembling at the realization that someone truly saw her, was already walking that tightrope between solace and seduction. All it would take was one night. One moment of vulnerability. One door left unlocked. So the true tragedy wasn't in the act of betrayal itself, but in the erosion of belief, that even if they broke, they could be rebuilt. That even if they wandered, they could find their way home. Because now, with every passing hour, that belief was slipping away, replaced by resignation and emotional retreat. And perhaps that is how all love dies, not with fury or fireworks, but with slow, silent choices that draw two hearts away from each other, until the space between them becomes too wide to cross. But the true tragedy was never about who would betray first. It was about the quiet, devastating truth that the two people who once loved each other with everything they had no longer possessed the will to fight for what they had built. Love, no matter how passionate, cannot survive in a vacuum. It needs tending. It needs belief. It needs two hearts willing to meet halfway even when the road is broken. But somewhere between the first white lie and the last quiet dinner filled with empty silence, Curtis and Portia had lost their will to reach for each other. And now, with both standing on opposite shores of their shared history, they were watching the tide carry everything they had away, too tired, too proud, or too wounded to swim after it. Curtis sat alone in the dim light of their once shared apartment, a single lamp casting long shadows across the walls that had once echoed with laughter and whispered dreams. He sifted through a box tucked away on the top shelf of the closet, his fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against the edges of wedding photographs coated in a fine layer of dust, a symbol of how long it had been since those moments felt real. There they were, frozen in time, smiling in a way they hadn't smiled in months. In the pictures, their eyes met with warmth and trust. But now, Curtis couldn't even remember the last time he had looked into Portia's eyes and seen anything but distance. The images blurred as his vision stung, and he quietly set the photos aside, not because they didn't matter, but because they mattered too much. Across town, in the cold fluorescent glow of General Hospital, Portia stood by a window that overlooked the courtyard below. The world outside bustled with life, nurses rushing by, patients being wheeled through the garden, lives intersecting in fleeting ways. And among them, Isaiah walked with his usual quiet grace, pausing to speak to a young patient, a gentle smile curving his lips. Portia watched him not with longing, but with something deeper, an aching recognition. He was the embodiment of the stability, attention, and understanding she had begged for in silence but never received. She told herself it wasn't romantic. It was just human. The human need to be seen. To be known. To matter. As she stood there, numb to the beeping machines and the clinical conversations behind her, Portia felt something shift within her. It wasn't a thunderclap of realization, nor a sudden surge of guilt. It was quieter than that. It was the slow, aching understanding that the love she had shared with Curtis wasn't being torn apart by one catastrophic event. It was dissolving, particle by particle, in the long stretches of silence between them. In the decisions they no longer made together. In the mornings they woke up next to each other but didn't speak. In the nights they rolled to opposite sides of the bed, physically close but galaxies apart. Love doesn't always die in flames. Sometimes it dies like this. In silence, in routine, in the quiet erosion of effort. It dies when you stop trying to explain yourself, because you've accepted they'll never listen. It dies when you reach out in your mind but not with your hands. It dies when comfort becomes complacency, and emotional safety becomes isolation. Curtis and Portia weren't enemies. They didn't scream or throw plates. They just stopped choosing each other. And once that stopped, everything else began to fall apart. Now, as their hearts wandered further into the orbits of others, Curtis toward the steady familiarity of Jordan, and Portia toward the soft understanding of Isaiah, the window of redemption had begun to close. Not with fury, but with resignation. What remained wasn't a battlefield, but a graveyard of what could have been. The dreams they had once shared, of family dinners, vacations, laughter echoing through hallways, had become ghost stories told only in memory, each one tinged with regret. In a town like Port Charles, where every love is tested by lies, ambition, and the constant whisper of the past, the most painful truths are often the simplest. What is broken beyond recognition cannot always be repaired. And what is forgotten is eventually picked up by someone else, someone willing to see value in what was once cast aside. Curtis and Portia had not just lost each other, they had lost the version of themselves that believed they were worth fighting for. And as they each stepped further into new connections that offered what their marriage no longer could, they weren't just choosing new people. They were choosing to let go. Perhaps that is the bitterest truth of all, not that betrayal kills love, but that love can die long before anyone dares to betray. And when it does, all that's left are fractured memories, unhealed scars, and the haunting echo of what might have been. In the stillness that followed their emotional drift, it became painfully clear that the demise of Curtis and Portia's marriage had not come from one explosive act, but from the accumulation of countless, quiet disappointments. There had been no defining betrayal, no single moment where one turned their back on the other with finality. Instead, love had slowly withered in the spaces where attention should have lived, in the pauses that should have been filled with understanding, and in the questions left unanswered for too long. Each day that passed without intimacy, without conversation, without tenderness became another thread pulled loose from the fabric of their bond. And by the time they noticed the unraveling, the tapestry they once wove so carefully had already begun to disintegrate in their hands. The tragedy wasn't in the loss itself, but in how little they had done to prevent it. Their silence was not peace, it was surrender. Curtis, who once had the clarity of a man sure of his path, now walked through his days with the quiet resignation of someone who no longer believed in repair. Alone in the apartment they once called home, surrounded by echoes of laughter and promises made beneath candlelight, he found no comfort in memories. Each photograph, each keepsake, each artifact of a life built together now served as a monument to what he had lost. He could remember the way Portia used to look at him, with faith in her eyes and a world of trust behind her smile. But that look had vanished long ago, replaced by guarded expressions and cold detachment. And though a part of him still longed to reach for her, to ask if they could begin again, the greater part, the weary, disillusioned part, knew that they had both already begun writing new stories in the arms of other people. Portia, meanwhile, struggled with the weight of her own choices. Standing at the edge of windows, watching Isaiah with a sense of fragile yearning, she wrestled with emotions she didn't know how to name. It wasn't love, not yet. But it was comfort, stability, and a reflection of the attention she had once craved from Curtis and no longer expected to receive. Isaiah represented a mirror to the woman she still wanted to be, strong, seen, cared for. In his presence, she felt less like the shell of a forgotten wife and more like someone rediscovering her worth. And yet, the guilt that clung to her was not because of anything she had done, but because of what she had allowed herself to feel. She had not betrayed Curtis with her body, but she had done so with her heart. And in some ways, that cut deeper. Because emotional betrayal speaks to what is missing, not just in a marriage, but within the soul of the one who remains. In the end, what lingered between them was not love, nor hatred, but a profound absence, a hollow space where something sacred once lived. The final blow wasn't screamed across a room or written in a letter left behind. It was the silence that filled their shared spaces, the disinterest in reconciliation, the quiet acceptance that they were both already halfway out the door. In Port Charles, where stories of redemption often rise from the ashes of ruin, this one would offer no such salvation. There would be no dramatic reunion, no last-minute confession to stop the inevitable. Curtis and Portia had let go not with fury, but with fatigue. And as they each stepped forward into futures no longer intertwined, they carried with them not just the weight of what they had lost, but the understanding that some love stories end. Not in betrayal, but in forgetting how to hold on.